was a time when somebody asked Jesus, what's the greatest commandment? Right? Simple question. Everybody knew that God had rules and that things were important to him. But this person specifically wanted to know what was most important to God. And Jesus' response becomes immortalized, not only through scripture, but even for his earliest followers. Here's what Jesus said. He said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and the greatest commandment. The second, the co-greatest commandment, though, right up there with it, is like it. It's love your neighbor as yourself. You want to know what's most important to God? Well, love God and love your neighbor. And Jesus didn't just mean the people that live next to you. A neighbor was everyone in the ripple effect of your life. And Jesus says, you want to know what's right on the top of God's list, right? It's love your neighbor. And there probably hasn't been a time in all of our lives where we haven't needed this command more than we do right now, right? And there's probably never been a time in the life of our church where we've never needed more clarity or never needed this command more than we currently do. Now, if we're going to be able to apply this command to the current culture that we're living in, we need clarity about the common ground that we're going to stand on together and hold together as a church, as a group of people, no matter what comes our way. And we don't just need clarity, my friends, we need help. I need help, if I'm being honest. The command, love your neighbor, it's written and spoken so often, honestly, it feels kind of cliche or kind of cute. Oh my goodness, the more that I look at my own heart and the more that I look around me, the less cute Jesus' command becomes. The more that I look out on the world, especially over the last few years, the more profound it becomes, the more revolutionary it feels, the more rare it seems, the more desperate we are for it. And is anybody else in this room tonight, this Thursday night, desperate for some more love your neighbor in our culture? I know I am, and that's why we're looking at the story that Jesus told that defines this command, a story that shows what is required by the command to love your neighbor, a story that were we to embrace it would instantly begin to take this profound command of Jesus off the pages of our Bibles and into our hearts, our communities, our homes, our schools, the culture, our cities. And it's a story that has the power to move us in the direction of, keep us in the place of, and maybe even enable us to lead others to love our neighbors. In the context of this story, it is crucial. The passage that we're going to look at today is found in the gospel account, the story of Jesus from a historian, a doctor, one of the earliest followers of Jesus, and his name was Luke. And in this instance, Jesus is talking to a crowd, and sure enough, as he's talking, the subject matter of what's important to God comes up. And as I'm sure he did multiple times, whenever this came up and everywhere that he went, Jesus affirms the greatest commandment, love God and love your neighbor. But this time in this audience was an expert in the Jewish law. And he decided this expert, he was going to spar with Jesus. What a great idea, right? So instead of letting Jesus off with an easy answer or the answer that he's given so many other times, this expert asks a question, and what he is looking for is a loophole. Here's how Luke describes it. But he, the expert in the law, wanted to justify himself. And so he asks Jesus, who's my neighbor? You can hear the challenge in that question, right? It's like, okay, that's cool, Jesus, right? You love your neighbor, sure. Like, what does that even mean, right? And he's probably looking around to his buddies around him like, I got it. And in response to him, Jesus takes his audience, and indirectly he takes us out of our comfort zones and applies the command to love your neighbor in the hardest possible context. He gave us the parable, the story of the Good Samaritan. And I gotta warn you that what happened to me, it might happen to you. You might be caught off guard by this story once we dive into it. You see, we hear the phrase the Good Samaritan all the time. It's cultural at this point, but I'm telling you that the story that Jesus actually tells around it, it is so rich and it is so real that when I actually spent time into it, when I actually dove into it, it hit me hard. It was eye-opening, and if I'm being fully transparent, it was a little humiliating when I compared it to my own life. You guys, this is what God is literally teaching me in real time, right here, right now. So thank you for being on this journey with me, but also you're on this journey with all of us together. This is safe. We're exploring this together. And so we're going to listen to Jesus illustrate for us in creative and dramatic fashion what it means to love your neighbor. And I believe Jesus is giving us a to-do list for loving our neighbors. And I believe, and what God has convicted me of, is that without this list, we cannot fulfill his command. I mean, we can think the way that Jesus wants us to think about him, about why we do what we do, but unless we actually do what he's asking us to do, we're gonna miss it. So here's the list. I'm gonna go ahead and give it to you. So spoiler alert, you ready? If you want to move in the direction of and set up camp on the ground of loving your neighbor, there is a need to notice, there's a barrier to break through, and there is a price to pay. If we, you and I, are going to be the type of people, if we are going to be the type of church that loves our neighbors as Jesus intends us to, there is a need that we are going to have to be in the habit of noticing. There's a barrier that we're going to have to find the courage to break through. And most importantly, there is a price that we are going to have to be willing to pay. So let's start with the need to notice. This is where Jesus launches into his parable and starts to get really descriptive. Here's what he has to say. See, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he fell into the hands of robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, they beat him, they went away, leaving him half dead on the side of the road. So let's be really clear here. A Jewish man has been robbed, beaten, left on the side of the road, naked, bleeding, unconscious, unable to move, and probably dead by nightfall. And Jesus brings our attention to a neighbor in need. And the implied question in this story at this point is, do you see it? Do you notice the need? Because that's what is required by this thing that is most important to God. You see, loving your neighbor means noticing their need. It means noticing the family down the street that's going through financial hardship. It means noticing your coworker who let slip that they have a family member who's sick. It means noticing that friend of your kid whose parents are getting divorced. It means noticing that homeless person that's on the side of the road day after day with the same sign, day by day by day. It means noticing anyone who's in need, in danger, at risk, or being taken advantage of. It means noticing anyone who's been exposed in any way to harm or injustice or degradation. My friends, have you noticed your neighbors in need over the last few years? Have you noticed the neighbor in need in moments of racial tension, of rising costs, political division, maybe your simple busyness? Jesus is saying loving your neighbor means noticing their need, and I believe that this paints a picture because it's not a given that we're going to notice, not in our day, and evidently it's not in theirs either, because that's the story that Jesus tells. That's the narrative that he plays out, and it's the narrative that played out for me, if I'm being functionally and truly honest. See, as I'm writing this, I'm sitting at our dinner table the other night, and I'm asking my wife, Jess, have I been doing this? I just want to make sure I'm being as intellectually honest as I can be. I want to be on the journey with us as we're doing this. And she is immediately able to pinpoint my best friend, whose life has completely fallen apart over the last 10 months. Job lost, socially cast out, legal troubles, literal rock bottom, can't get any worse. And she asked me so simply to cut through the tension that I felt when she said it, when's the last time you even tried to text him? And I was left speechless. Because it had been 4 months since I'd seen him, let alone even text him. I didn't notice. That's the point that Jesus is trying to show us. How easy it is. How easy it is. And so Jesus actually continues his story. It says a priest happened to be going down the same road. Thank God a priest is coming. And when he saw him, here it comes. When he saw the man, he passed on by the other side. A priest, if you're not sure what that is in our day, it's kind of like a pastor, but in their day, this was the man who mediated the relationship between the Jewish people and God at the temple. He was a shepherd, a guide, a teacher. He was a good man. And here he comes upon this dying countryman and someone he could have possibly even helped at the temple. And somehow he walks on by. Perhaps he had urgent business for God. Perhaps it's because he thought that the man was already dead, and in their law, if you touched a dead person, you'd be ceremonially unclean for a substantial amount of time and unable to work in workman's comp as always and all of that stuff. You guys get it. It's paperwork. But perhaps it was because he figured out that someone else was probably right behind and would be here any moment, and they are way more equipped than I am. Anyone ever felt that before? We don't know, though. But he walked on by. He saw the situation and he turned a blind eye. And the story continues. So too, a Levite came. And when he came to the place, here it is, he came and he passed on by the other side. A Levite also worked in the religious system within Judaism. And think like someone like who volunteers at church, a good person. And he comes upon this man, and for reasons that we can only guess at, he too walks on by. He sees the situation. He turns a blind eye. And I think that Jesus wants us to be bothered by this, not so that we could criticize these two and be like, ugh, they're just bad apples, right? Ugh, they're not nice people. No, these were normal people. One of them was a priest, right? These were good people. And that's what should bother us, is that they are no different than you, and they are definitely no different than me, that we're all susceptible to the same mistakes like they were, because good people will always find good reasons to walk on by. Good people will always find good reasons to just keep walking, reasons that make sense, reasons that if people hear them, they go, well, yeah. It's like really unfortunate, sad. But he did the right thing. Technically, after all, you had to go to church. You had to go to work. You had that thing that came up. So number one, there's a need to notice. Let's move on to number two, because it's here that the hero of our story comes in, the one who notices, the one who actually stops walking. And the character of Jesus that he chooses to use for the hero is incredibly controversial. In fact, if you and I had been in the audience that day, chances are that you and we would have gotten mad at Jesus. Chances are that you and I would have argued with Jesus when he was done. Chances are that some of you would have tweeted something snarky or posted some stats and tagged Jesus in it while he was standing in front of all of you. But here's the thing. Jesus wasn't trying to just make his audience feel comfortable. No, he was trying to make them intentionally feel uncomfortable. He was trying to pull his audience, pull you and I out of our current standards, beyond our current versions of what loving your neighbor could look like, that this early audience had so carefully constructed. And so Jesus brings in a Samaritan. It goes like this. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came to where the man was, and collectively his entire Jewish audience groans. Ugh. Eyes start rolling. Frustrations start to rise. Arguments are already being formed and calculated in our minds. Why? Well, it's because the Jews and the Samaritans were not friendly neighbors. Their bad relationship had actually been going on for centuries. It went all the way back in time to when Israel was split between a northern and a southern kingdom. In the 9th century, King Omri made Samaria the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel, in direct opposition to Jerusalem, the capital city of the southern kingdom of Judah. It was a national divide. It was a national conflict. And that national divide also then becomes a spiritual divide when in the north, in the temple in Samaria, they erect a temple to Baal. And it becomes a center of idolatry in complete defiance of the temple in Jerusalem and the priesthood in Jerusalem. And the national divide becomes spiritual division, which becomes racial division, because the Assyrians end up invading that northern kingdom. And Jews who were living in Samaria, they're called Samaritans, they intermarry with their captors. And their pure Jewish blood becomes tainted by foreigners. And so I don't want you to miss this mess that Jesus has created within the story. I mean, it is centuries of resentment. It is centuries of conflict. It is centuries of racial prejudice. I mean, come on, if only Jesus could put together a story that was at all relevant to 2024. Can you believe it? That's the context of the Good Samaritan. Jesus' illustration of what it means to love your neighbor is one that is deeply filled with national and spiritual and racial division. Why? Because he wanted us to understand a second profound and powerful point, that there's not just a need to notice. There is a barrier to break through. Think about all the barriers the Samaritan had to break through to help this Jewish neighbor. He had to break through the barrier of his own comfort and schedule. He was on his way. He had to stop. This guy was bleeding. He was sweaty. He was dirty. He was ill. He had to break through social norms. Did I mention that he was naked and unconscious on the ground? And if you are laying down naked and unconscious on the ground, I am so sorry. I am not picking you up. I will maybe find a blanket and I will cover you and I will move on, but that is weird. He had to break through barriers of patriotism like, we are enemies. You are everything that is wrong with this country right now. He had to break through barriers of religion. How could you believe that? You believe the wrong things. You're crazy. He had to break through barriers of status. All you Jews think you are so much better than us. He had to break through barriers of racial prejudice, animosity, suspicion, and stereotypes. Each of these men had centuries of stories, talking points, and narratives, grudges between them, and the barriers between them were monumental and catastrophic, yet somehow this Samaritan breaks through. And here's what Jesus says. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. 3 men walked by. Only one loves his neighbor. Why? Because he noticed the need, and he broke through the barrier. Question. What barriers have traditionally kept you from loving some of your neighbors? Have you seen a barrier in the story that we've been going through that looks or sounds or feels a little familiar? I know I have. And if you do, I don't want you to feel judged, attacked. I don't want you to feel guilty. Because we all have them. I mean, remember, even the priest of Judaism, he felt them, and he was a good man, like the best man. And remember, that was Jesus' point. He is telling us the story because he intends for us to identify and call out the barriers in our lives that are keeping us from loving some of our neighbors. So, genuinely, what are they? And maybe you should name them. Because until we know what they are, we cannot break through them. And I would suggest, from writing this, and from my own personal experience, my own personal confession, that the greatest barrier for loving your neighbor, the greatest barrier for loving my neighbor, is my baggage and my bandwidth. It's not my bank account. The greatest barrier for loving our neighbor is generally our baggage and our bandwidth. It's not our bank account. You see, we can usually have or collectively find the resources to help a neighbor, and that's usually not the greatest challenge. No, the greatest challenge is usually breaking through all the other stuff, like discomfort, like my own inconvenience, the pain of sacrifice, the complexity of a problem, the messiness of a situation, the history of a conflict, the slights, the mistakes, the wrongs, all of the stuff that led to the original thing in the first place. It could be an extreme difference of an opinion or an appearance or a political or social narrative that's been built and built and built and built and sometimes hiked up beyond all reason. I mean, sometimes this is mine truly is just a normal rhythm of life. Schedule, my distance, our presence, my availability, those are the things that are usually the most challenging barriers to overcome. We all have barriers, but if you are going to love your neighbor as Jesus has commanded, it's going to require a breakthrough. So 1, there is a need to notice. 2, there is a barrier to break through. And then finally, And most importantly and most powerfully, there is a price to pay. And that's exactly what the Samaritan does, which is how the story continues. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine, and then put the man on his own donkey, took him to an inn, took care of him, and then the next day he took out 2 silver coins. By the way, that's like a day or two's wages, like whole day. So a lot of money for a very small amount of time. And he gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. He noticed the need. He broke through the barrier. And then he paid the price for his neighbor's healing. Not only did he give up his own medical supplies for the journey that he was on before meeting this person, he put him on his own mode of transportation. He took him to the nearest hotel, opened up a tab, and said to the innkeeper, whatever you've got to do to take care of this man, put it on me. And you guys, that's the final thing that we are called to do. The final thing that loving your neighbor means, it means paying the price. Each one of us who follow Jesus are called to pay the price for our neighbor's healing. And I imagine that at this point in the story, seeing this Samaritan be the hero, the entire audience goes silent. And they're convicted. They're cut to the heart. Imagine they're standing there like you and like me right now, and they're contemplating their own lives. They're thinking about their own neighbors, the people in their wake. And Jesus cuts through that silence and that tension, and he asks us the question, which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell in the hands of the robbers? It's not smug. It's just a genuine question. Which one? The expert in the law replies, the one who had mercy on him. It's the one who noticed the need, the one who broke through a barrier, the one who paid the price. And then Jesus ends with these 4 powerful words, go and do likewise. What's going to get the command to love your neighbor off the pages of our Bibles and into our hearts, in the streets, our schools, our homes, culture, our cities? It's going and doing likewise. Committing to a course of action, resolving to be a people who notice the need, break through the barriers, and pay the price for our neighbor's healing. And I don't know about you, but when I think about that picture of what life could be like, it is powerful. Whether you're a Christian or not, whether you're a church person or not, don't you want that to happen in our community? I do. Listen, for those of us who follow Jesus, this isn't just a hypothetical. This is who we are. For Jesus followers, this isn't some ideal that we read about in the Bible. This is who we are supposed to be. This is who we are supposed to, how people are supposed to experience us in times like these. Because a good Samaritan isn't a term that Jesus coined to describe heroes. It is a term coined to describe Christians. It's us. It's who we are. We're the people who pay the price, whether that's a dollar amount, or whether it's simply the cost of our time, whether that means we cut something from our overscheduled lives, or being willing to invest where we've been selfish. It's our presence. It's our voice, our assistance, a listening ear. It's opening arms. We're being the people who notice needs, who break barriers, who pay the price for our neighbors' healings. It's who we are, or at a minimum, it's who we're supposed to be. Like when that family with the political flag or the identity flag on your streets going through a real struggle and everyone's just walking by. We stop and we pay the price. We knock on the door and we say, what do you need? What can we do? When you're Muslim or atheist coworker let slip that a family member's gotten really sick and everyone's just walking by, we stop and we pay the price. What do you need? What can I do? When that father of one of your kids' teammates gets that terrible diagnosis and everyone is just walking by because, we're all busy and I don't want to be too much on them right now. No. We don't walk. We stop and we pay the price. What do you need? What can I do? When single moms are struggling and too many people are walking by, we don't. We stop and we pay the price. When kids don't have safe homes to live in or food to eat and too many people are walking right by, we don't. We're the people who pay the price. When racism shows its ugly face, we are not the people who walk by. We're the people who stop. We join the efforts. We pay the price for our neighbor's healing. We stand against it. We take criticism if we have to. We get uncomfortable when we need to, but we don't turn a blind eye. No, we pull up a chair to the table and we say, I'm with you. I'll pay the price. Whenever we find pockets of prejudice or patterns of injustice, we are not the people that walk on by simply because it doesn't affect us. No, we're the people that break the barrier. We're the people that get into the mess and join the effort to pay the price for our neighbor's healing. We educate ourselves if we need to. We speak up when we have to. We lean in locally to whatever work needs to be done. We don't wait on someone else. Are you kidding me? No, we are the church. We are the people who stand up and we stop and we pay the price because that is what we have been called to be. Or for that matter, when anyone, anywhere, in any time in our future of any color, culture, or character lying on the side of the road that we as Jesus followers would relish, that we would crave to stop, to be the people who would model what it looks like to live out the love that Jesus has called us to stop and notice that need, to break barriers and to pay a price. And I need you to hear this. This isn't just me doing some platitude for the kingdom of God. No. Think about it this way, even so pragmatically. What is the world you want your children walking into? It's one where the love of God is inherent in how we act, but this is so important, and I need you to not miss this. I'm not saying that there is a right way that you need to be doing this, or that you need to be like me, or that you need to be like her or him or them or a specific group. No. The beauty of this movement of people that we call a church is that every single one of us can move in our own ways. And those ways are as diverse as the colors of our skin and the wirings of our minds, the makeups of our personality and our individual abilities. There are so many options for loving your neighbor, like the Good Samaritan. And the only thing that isn't an option is to walk on by. Because that's what it means to love your neighbor. And so for me, standing in front of all of you, I need to address the elephant in the room and the tension that I have in my own heart. My friend, my best friend, the one who I went radio silent on, the one whose need is massive, not just professionally or personally, but relationally. So I sent the text. That text saying, hey, I miss you. I know life is hard, that you maybe wish it was different. Maybe wish you weren't feeling so lost, but I love you. And I'm with you. Whatever you need, get a hold of me. And I wish I could tell you that this is resolved and there's this beautiful picture with a bow on it, but it is not. I haven't heard back yet. But I will tell you, my friends, I will no longer be the person who does not notice. The person who balks at a barrier, the person unwilling to pay the price for healing. You see, I said it earlier, good people will always find good reasons to walk on by, but God's people will always have God's reasons to be the one who stops, which inherently divides our room into two audiences. The first is people who follow Jesus. My question to those of you who do is, are you the one who stops? Because if you said you follow, and you believe that everyone is someone that Jesus died for, but you've had lots of good reasons to keep on going, maybe it's time to join me and to go and do likewise. In a season where division and isolation are on the rise, imagine the church were leading the way in this type of posture and behavior. I know that's what I dream of. And maybe you are too, but imagine the day when not just the church, but our church is leading the pack in loving our neighbor. It's beautiful. It's right. It's what God is calling us to. And then there's a second audience. It's people who probably don't define themselves as someone who follows Jesus, and it's likely good people. And I mean that genuinely. It's people who are probably doing as much good as you can do. But what if I told you that Jesus invites us into something more than simply doing good? That he's not just a guy from a few thousand years ago who we know about because of loud and sometimes controversial people. You see, Jesus was and is a king like no other. And I want to pause on that moment because when I say a king, we all have pictures of what the high and mighty act like, right? What the rich, what the powerful, what the politically significant behave like. But the thing is, Jesus is like no other king. Because no other king would literally touch a super infectious, diseased person with leprosy. No other king would eat meals with the culturally marginalized, with sex workers and the socially unacceptable. No other king would take time to hear the stories of men and women who are just normal but on their last thread. And no other king would sacrifice himself for everyone and not just a stake at a kingdom that he owned, and would even do it in the most brutal and horrific ways on a cross. And no other king has come back from the dead. And that King Jesus is standing right now with an invitation for you and I into a kingdom that is so upside down and different from our own selfish and individualized ways of thinking. And so my question for those of you who do not define yourself as someone who is following Jesus, can you imagine? Can you imagine how much your world would change if you followed a king like that? All of the change that would work in you and through you. All of the hope, the peace, the joy. And so, like no other king could or ever would, Jesus invites you and invites me in to go and to do likewise, to follow, to trust him, to see his kingdom come in ways that change us and the world. I know that that's the king that I want to follow. And I want to invite you to follow him too.
Well, I really hope that was helpful for integrating faith with life. Listen, if you're in Northwest Indiana, I'd love to have you join us in person. Head over to suncrest.org and plan your visit.